In this video, we're going to take a look at animal phylogeny and classification. Phylogeny is just the study of the branching sequence of evolution. So phylogenetic trees are these kind of branching diagrams that show relationships between organisms and their shared ancestors. Now, these trees are hypotheses. So these are based on looking at things like the fossil record or looking at the morphology or the structures of different organisms and comparing them. Or we can even use molecular technologies. And this has actually been a real game changer when it comes to phylogeny, because being able to look at DNA sequences, both in the nucleus, which would be things like genomic DNA, or mitochondrial DNA, which only comes from the mother. We can also look at things like proteins and ribosomal RNA, so that R stands for ribosomal. And by comparing similarities and differences in these different molecules, we can actually make adjustments to what we think is happening or what we think has happened with regards to the evolution of new organisms over time. So these phylogenetic trees are constantly being updated as we learn new information. And that's really the process of science. So with science, we're always open to the thought that new information might allow us or make us change our understanding of something because we have this new information to now guide our understanding. So if we take a look at the classification of animals, and so animals are in the domain Eukarya, and remember this means that they are made up of eukaryotic cells. And hopefully you know this by now, but eukaryotic cells are cells that have a membrane-bound nucleus with the chromosomes inside the nucleus. They also have mitochondria, they have endoplasmic reticuli, they have Golgi apparatus, et cetera, et cetera. They also have multiple bar-shaped chromosomes that are found in the nucleus. The other domains that we talked about in an earlier lesson were domains bacteria and archaea. But for animals, they are in domain Eukarya. Remember that domain is kind of the broadest level of classification that we have. Now, moving from the broad classification of domain and moving towards a slightly more specific or more limited level of classification, animals are in the supergroup Opisthokonta, which includes the fungi. And we can see that here in this green. So Opisthokonta, and we see animals, which also includes fungi, which we've talked about in the past. And then the kingdom, and so once again, we are moving from domain, which was the broader classification, towards more specific. The kingdom is kingdom Animalia, so that should be pretty easy to remember since we're talking about animals. Now, there are additional classification schemes that we can just keep getting more and more specific until each individual organism gets its own species name. So we are going to talk a little bit more about things like phyla and class and families, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we've seen both of these phylogenetic trees before, and so now I'm going to kind of put them together. So this one on the left gets us to the animal level. And then this is essentially connecting here. So remember, metazoa refers to the animals. And then we can now start to classify the animals based on these different characteristics that we talked about. So remember, we talked about whether the animal has true tissues or not. And so that gives us our first separation or first dichotomy here. We can then talk about whether the Eumetazoa are bilateria, meaning that they have bilateral symmetry, or radiata, meaning that they have radial symmetry. If they have radial symmetry, we can then classify them as either cnidarians or comb jellies. If they have bilateral symmetry, we can classify them as protostomes or deuterostomes. If they are deuterostomes, we can then classify them as either chordates or echinoderms. If they are protostomes, we can further classify them as either ecdysozoa or lophotrochozoa. And then we can further classify them into their even more specific levels of classification. And we're going to talk about these different kind of more specific levels in some later lessons. So based on our current understanding of phylogeny in animals, remember that we started out by talking about animals that have truly differentiated tissues versus not. So the porifera, these are the sponges. They're also referred to as parazoa. And they do not have true differentiated tissues. And so this is kind of what the body of a sponge looks like. And they do have some specialized cells, but they're not really grouped together or functioning like tissues. And they likely share a common ancestor with choanoflagellates, which are protists that we talked about a few lessons ago. And you can see that this protist cell here looks basically identical to the cell that is found within a sponge here. I'm going to cross out Placozoa. We're actually not going to talk about those, and I forgot to remove it from this slide. So then our other classification, and remember, this is just our first branch in our phylogenetic tree. So does the organism not have tissues, meaning that it is now a porifera? Or does it have tissues, meaning that it is a eumetazoa? And so these are those animals with those true differentiated tissues. We can then take the eumetazoa and divide them into animals that have radial symmetry or animals that have bilateral symmetry. The animals that have bilateral symmetry, we can then further classify them into animals that are deuterostomes and animals that are protostomes. And then the protostomes we can further classify into ecdysozoans or lophotrochozoans. And so at each level, we are just making a branch in this phylogenetic tree. So we have not talked about these ecdysozoans and lophotrochozoans yet in any of the other videos. And so let's talk about those now. So the ecdysozoans are animals that molt an exoskeleton. So this is a picture of a whip scorpion that is currently molting. And so this kind of lighter area here, this is the exoskeleton that is being molted or left behind. And then the actual scorpion is essentially backing out of its shell. And so it's leaving its exoskeleton behind. And what it's going to do is it's going to pull out of its exoskeleton, and then it's going to essentially expand. It's going to grow and develop a new exoskeleton. And then the next time it needs to get bigger, it's going to molt again and then grow after it gets rid of its exoskeleton. So this is oftentimes found in things like arthropods, which are going to be insects. Now the other group of animals, the ones that are not ecdysozoans, are lophotrochozoans. And they are classified based on one of these two characteristics. So one of them is that in some phyla, they have a larval stage called a trochophore larva. And this is a free swimming or a free living swimming larva. And some phyla in this group have a lophophore feeding structure. And this is essentially a mouth with tentacles surrounding it. So you can see in this picture of a squid here, the mouth is kind of inside here and it's got these tentacles coming out around it.